Hi everyone. Yes, I'm Olivia Arigho-Stiles. Delighted to be chairing this panel on indigeneity and class struggles in the Andes. We've got four speakers. Two are going to be talking online. So I think we'll just kick off, and we'll start with Anthony Dest, who's going to be talking on Alfonso Cano's grave, FARC Vanguardism and Indigenous Autonomy in Conflict. Anthony, if you want to start, you've got 15 minutes.
Great. Wonderful. So, good afternoon. Thanks to everyone who made this possible, and I really appreciate making it possible for me to join virtually. I'm pretty excited to be on this panel, looking forward to hearing the other papers. And this one is based on a chapter from a book that I'm working on called Dissident Peace, an ethnography of struggle in Colombia. And I'm just going to go ahead and apologize in advance for reciting some of the longer quotes from the letters written by the FARC and the Asin Indigenous movement. But I think it's important to foreground their political analysis and voices. So also just very much looking forward to your criticisms and comments. So here we go. In March 2009, 10 months after replacing Manuel Marulanda, or Tiro Fijo, as the top commander of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, Alfonso Cano penned a letter addressed to, quote, the indigenous communities of Cauca. In it, he responded to an open letter signed by the Association of Indigenous Cabildos of Northern Cauca, or ASIN, which is now called Chabualaquiwe, and the Indigenous Regional Council of Cauca, or CREEC. And in that letter, he accused the FARC and the Colombian government of attempting to, quote, force them into the logic of war. That's the letter from the Asin and Creek. These two letters marked the beginning of an epistolary exchange that included at least 10 correspondences between 2009 and 2013, covering a variety of issues that range from the use of gas cylinder bombs to indigenous jurisdiction over captured FARC guerrillas. In addition to addressing the impacts of the war, the letters also revealed two contrasting perspectives on the role and reach of indigenous autonomy in the struggle. So the relationship between the FARC and the indigenous communities of Cauca predated the intensification of the armed conflict in northern Cauca during the 1990s and 2000s. In fact, the sixth point of the FARC's foundational agrarian program declared, quote, indigenous communities will be protected and given sufficient land for their development by returning the lands usurped by the latifundistas and modernizing their systems of cultivations. The indigenous communities will enjoy all of the benefits of the revolutionary agrarian policy. The agrarian program will also establish an autonomous organization for the communities, respecting their cabildos, way of life, culture, languages, and internal organization, end quote. The founding members of the FARC expected that the impoverished indigenous populations would serve as their allies in their efforts to overturn the quasi-feudal relations in the countryside. Throughout its existence, among its successor groups, many members of the FARC were of indigenous descent themselves. Yet their treatment of the, quote, indigenous question provided little space for dialogue or reimagining the content of the revolutionary program beyond the FARC's mandates. In relation to this so-called indigenous question, José Carlos Mariátegui, a Peruvian socialist praised by the FARC in a 2012 letter and strongly associated with forging a distinctly Latin American style of leftism in the early 20th century, repeated the following phrase verbatim throughout his writings, quote, the solution to the problem of the Indian must be a social solution. It must be worked out by the Indians themselves. And I've seen this several times in his writings, verbatim, as I mentioned. However, the FARC's contradictory approach to the, quote, indigenous question in Cauca hardly allowed space for the Nasa indigenous peoples to, quote, work it out for themselves, in spite of the rhetorical support for doing so. Cano's 2009 letter rehearsed the FARC's, quote, full and unconditional support, end quote, for the indigenous struggles as, quote, evidence of their permanent commitment and positive disposition towards the indigenous cause, to the point that today, various fronts and innumerable guerrilla units are made up primarily of combatants from different ethnic groups, heirs of the epic struggle for freedom by important indigenous heroes in national history, end quote. So by equating the individual participation of indigenous people in the ranks of the FARC with the support of the FARC by indigenous political platforms, that the FARC was essentially trying to find a way to sidestep criticism along these lines. So for example, during the June 2016 meetings that I attended between the FARC and the Ethnic Commission for Peace and Territorial Rights in Cuba during the peace negotiations, one FARC leader scoffed at the idea that the FARC needed to consult with the Black and indigenous organizations about the content of the peace accords. He said, "Why do you talk so much about prior consultation if we have an indigenous and Black base?" Building on what we were just discussing. His words minimized the space for debate about potentially divergent expressions of Black and indigenous demands. The Yacin's response to Cano's 2012 letter challenged the FARC's politics of representation with, quote, they say, quote, "We can't deny that indigenous milicianos are indigenous. We're not blind. But the moment that they decided to become permanent members of a military organization, they renounced their status as civilians and placed themselves outside of our political community," end quote. For the Yacin, becoming part of a guerrilla group or the Colombian military separated an indigenous individual from the, quote, indigenous political community. So over the course of decades, if not centuries, this concept of an indigenous political community developed in dialogue with autochthonous struggles to resist colonization, international frameworks supporting indigenous rights in the latter half of the 20th century, and historical memory linking the past with the present. For example, the formation of the Creek served as the key moment in defining the indigenous political community during the latter half of the 20th century. In 1971, indigenous comuneros or commoners from Cauca split off from Colombia's largest peasant organization, the National Association of Peasant Users, or ANUC, and formed the Creek. Indigenous members of the ANUC did not feel represented by the ANUC's class-based demands that sidelined indigenous difference. According to Gregorio Palechor, one of the Creek's leaders at the time, quote, "ANUC accused us of being racist, pro-indigenous trade unionists. They slandered our leaders. They were out to swallow up our organization and manipulate it for their own ends." And he's talking about the ANUC in this moment, end quote. The Creek's definition of indigenous political community centered on the principles of unity, land, culture, and autonomy. Over the course of the following decades, the efforts to build, quote, indigenous political community frequently clashed with the Colombian state and the FARC, as well as other armed groups. These confrontations became more violent and led to the creation of new indigenous political formations to defend the territory. So, for example, the Quintin Lame armed movement, or the Movimiento Armado Quintin Lame, drew inspiration from its namesake, an indigenous leader from Cauca who led a series of land occupations to reclaim territory in the early 20th century. The MAQL emerged as an armed self-defense group for the indigenous communities of Northern Cauca in the early 80s and quickly entered into direct conflict with the FARC, as well as other guerrilla factions, the army, police, and local landowners. And in this escalating conflict, it basically ended up resulting in the drafting of something that became known as the Vitonco Resolution of 1985 between the FARC and indigenous communities, where the Creek asserted its, quote, right to autonomy. That is to say, the right of the cabildos and the communities to control, monitor, and organize their social and political life in the resguardos, and to reject the policies imposed from outside, regardless of where they come from. So as a result of pressure by the communities, the FARC ended up signing this agreement in 1987 with the Creek that reaffirmed its need to respect the sixth point of the agrarian program that I read earlier. Nevertheless, the presence of the FARC continued to cause friction with the region's indigenous communities, as evidenced by the Yacin's 1999 Declaration of the Territories on Coexistence, Dialogue, and Negotiation, and the Creek's mandates of Ambalo in 1996 and Hambalo in 2000. These conflicts bled into the 21st century, and on July 9th, 2011, the FARC detonated a bus full of explosives next to a police station on Market Day in Toribio. And this is a town in northern Cauca with the reputation for being one of the most attacked by guerrillas in the country. And it's primarily indigenous. That explosion killed 5 people, injured more than 100, and destroyed several homes. In addition to this chiva bomba or bus bomb in Toribio, the FARC conducted a bunch of attacks throughout the region of northern Cauca and municipalities of Corinto, Caldono, Hambaló, and Paez at right about the same time. And what these attacks seemed to do was to appear as a diversionary tactic for the guerrillas to get Alfonso Cano, the commander, safe passage. And he was en route to the Pacific coast because he was being attacked in his base in Cañón de las Hermosas in the neighboring department of Tolima. So what they did was they attacked this indigenous municipality to attract the military so he could make it to the Pacific coast. And in response to these bombings, which caused all of that harm and the systematic attacks on its leadership, the Yasin published a strongly worded statement on July 20th, 2011, entitled Ending the War, Defending Our Autonomy, Reconstructing the Public Good, and Building the Peace, demanding the, quote, demilitarization of indigenous territories. They also amplified the activities of the Indigenous Guard, a volunteer community watch group for indigenous people, sorry, one sec, armed only with wooden batons and walkie-talkies to monitor the conflict in the area and provide a semblance of protection for the communities with the Yasin. So by equating the role of the FARC in the communities with that of the state, and therefore distancing their autonomous political project from either, the Yasin argued, quote, both the invasion of our territories by the official army and the occupation of our communities by the insurgency promote an extractive territorial and economic model that is dependent on the profitability of natural resources, therefore reproducing a system of dispossession and annihilation that indigenous peoples have known for centuries, end quote. So following Operation Odysseus in November 2011, which resulted in the death of Alfonso Cano right before the official onset of the peace negotiations in 2012, the FARC retaliated with another series of attacks on police and military outposts throughout Cauca. And in March 2012, they published a video entitled Report on the War, Comandante Alfonso Cano Present and in Combat, documenting their exploits with videos of the attacks in January and February, along with body counts for each battle. And that same month, the FARC's Joint Western Command, the CCO, or the CCO, Comando Conjunto de Occidente, issued a statement addressed to the indigenous communities, again, of Northern Cauca, that started the following way, quote, once again, we appeal to the word that, like a bridge, can communicate between opposite shores of the same river, the civil struggle of the indigenous communities and the armed resistance of the people. Both are fundamental for the struggle of Colombians to build a dignified future for everyone, end quote. The tone of the FARC's 2012 statement turned sharply after about 7 paragraphs criticizing the government's neoliberal policies, taking credit for successful efforts to reclaim indigenous land, and lamenting the involvement of indigenous comuneros in the war. But here's what the FARC had to say about indigenous autonomy, and this is what I find really important. They say, in that context, the erroneous and deceitful interpretation of autonomy spread by certain leaders cultivates hatred amongst the comuneros and promotes a confrontational spirit in the assemblies, not only against the presence of the guerrillas, but also against their own indigenous brothers who distance themselves from policies that are amenable to the state. In that regard, they, the indigenous communities, promote hostile actions that end up turning the indigenous guard into a mere extension of the policing arm of the establishment and converting their hostility into the best weapon in support of the governing elites and the empire's transnationals, end quote. And the quote goes on, it says, just like the immortal Jose Carlos Mariátegui, we believe that the land has always been the joy of the Indian in regards to its material and spiritual value. That is why we think that as long as the indigenous territories are not effectively secured for their peoples, as long as self-governments are not a guarantee for social justice and order in their communities, as long as the military maintains a threatening presence, and as long as there is a risk of exploiting the natural resources in the territories, the presence of the FARC EP will continue to be legitimate in those territories, end quote. The FARC's full-throated critique of the Yasin and Creek's efforts to build forms of autonomy conform to their wider practice of stigmatizing and attacking Black and Indigenous communities that advocated for self-determination. Letters by the Yasin and Creek, as well as statements by several other Black and Indigenous organizations throughout Colombia, consistently condemn violence against their leadership and denounce the formation of parallel organizations by the FARC as forms of undermining the authority of the cabildos, resguardos, and Afro-Colombian community councils. Yet, According to the FARC's analysis of neoliberal multiculturalism in the context of a protracted counterinsurgency campaign, this opposition to that form of autonomy was consistent with their revolutionary program. So according to one mestizo ex-FARC guerrilla that I interviewed, state recognition of Black and Indigenous autonomy created a, quote, minority trap that benefited the capitalist state. So according to him, quote, it's a minority trap where every minority gets their own space. I recognize you as a minority, I'll give you authority. Now leave me the hell alone. The rest of the world keeps moving to the beat of my drum. And the minority from its local autonomous zone says, okay, you leave me the hell alone and I'll be fine here in my reduced space. We think that shouldn't be reduced to local autonomies. Instead, we must struggle to find themes that cut across all of the spaces and sectors of society in Colombia, regionally and globally. That is to say, we, FARC or FARC sympathizers, must find universalisms because the world will never be transformed if we don't. End quote. So according to him, this former FARC guerrilla, these forms of territorial autonomy were another example of the doomed efforts to, quote, change the world without taking power, in an unprovoked reference to John Holloway's book, which he identified as another cool poem, but it means very little in real terms. So instead of advocating for what he might have considered vulgar identity politics, oppressed people need to develop an all-encompassing universalist framework of transforming society that included taking state power. However, as indicated by the alienating aspects of the FARC's class-based approaches to politics for organizations like the Yasin and the Creek, the FARC's ability to make the people interpret the message of their true representatives appeared unlikely without resorting to world-shattering levels of violence. And I'm about to wrap up here. In their first two letters to Timochenko, Alfonso Cano's successor as commander of the FARC and co-signer of the peace accords, Yasin responded to the FARC's condemnation of indigenous autonomy the following way. In order to oppose our project of a territorial autonomy, the CCO talks about supposedly real autonomy, which consists of something that apparently appeals to the guerrilla commanders. That's the same autonomy that the government talks about, one that takes orders from their ministers and generals. But when we say self-determination, we mean self-determination, not authorized autonomy, autonomía tutelada. Autonomy does not consist of an armed actor or an intellectual or a politician or a religious person or a legal entity giving us a blessing in regards to how we should exercise it. Autonomy refers precisely to the contrary, that indigenous authorities and leaders are not accountable to anyone other than the organized community. In that regard, we are very distant from one another. If that's the FARC's position, then it's even more backwards than that of the capitalist states that at least approve of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the World. The leaders of the CCO say that indigenous peoples can't have autonomy as long as there are certain threats that they will, quote, combat, in their exact words. The first of which are self-governments, gobiernos propios. That is to say, our indigenous governments that, quote, are not a guarantee for social justice and order in their communities. We ask, from here on out, is the FARC going to combat the cabildos of the Yasin and Creek? What an enemy to pick, the popular organizations. If that's not what you meant to say, then why did you write it? To intimidate us? Is it as a typo? Whatever the reason, the peoples of Cauca are not going to give up for a politics of fear. The Yasin's position delineated a clear opposition to the FARC's hypocritical stance on autonomy and their violent approach to getting the support of the people. According to the Yasin, we are not on opposite shores of the same river as the CCO statement. I'll end that quote. So in conclusion, I want to think about what it means to move beyond authorized autonomy, or what the Yasin calls autonomía tutelada. In the last letter that I cited, but which I'm eager to hear if anyone has a better translation than authorized autonomy, I want to think about how does indigenous autonomous practice demonstrate the limit to the FARC's vanguardist political project, which remains embedded in so much of the left today. I think that by pushing towards a break with state-centric forms of autonomy, these indigenous movements are gesturing towards a revolutionary horizon that is threatening the forces of colonial capitalism and leftists that privilege a myopic and sordidly racist form of so-called universalism, to borrow some phrasing from Césaire. The threatening nature of indigenous autonomous practice is clearly evidenced by the enduring violence that they face on all fronts. Framed this way, some of these socialists and communists may be better served by scrapping the indigenous question and dealing with their own authoritarian questions. And sorry about the overtime. I appreciate your questions. I'm done. Thanks.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for having me here today, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm really happy to be here, though I'm sad that I cannot be there in person. I'm currently connecting from Colombia as I'm doing some field work here for my project, the one that I will present today. So as a form of introducing myself, I am a medical doctor from Colombia, and I did a PhD on global health and social medicine at King's College London. But right now, I am part of a Wellcome Trust project entitled Connecting Three Worlds, Socialism, Medicine, and Global Health after World War II. This is based at the University of Exeter, but the team is actually located in different parts of the world, mainly in Europe and some areas of Latin America. Now, in this project, we explore the question of what is socialist health in the context of the Cold War. And the premise of the project is that following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dismantling of the USSR, the history of global health, which is a topic that pertains us, has been written mostly from the models that won, quote unquote, the Cold War, that is the capitalist and the liberal politics. So in practice, what this means is that most of the historiographic research on global health is basically focused on health interventions linked to the big developmentalist health organizations like the WHO, the Rockefeller Foundation, the World Bank. Now, in the project, we argue that, yes, this is very important, very relevant, but at the same time, there is a myriad of other experiences that are linked to socialism or leftist politics that, because of the ideological divide, has been mostly neglected and even stigmatized. So we're trying to bring these historiographic case studies for an in-depth discussion. So much more on this in the website. I definitely encourage you to check it out. Now, the project is divided in 3 different teams looking at case studies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I am part of the Latin American group. And so what we're doing there is that, contrasting many of the histories in Asia and Africa, historians of the Latin American Cold War, as you may know, argue that the region didn't really experience a typical ideological divide, but that it exhibits a clear history of anti-communism and state violence. So think of the military junta, the dictatorial states, the Condor operation, which, under the banner of national security, very closely linked with the US foreign policy, these regimes worsen a very long-standing land conflict, and this is what assisted the guerrilla insurgencies. So with this context in mind, with the project, today I'm going to present a bit more on the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia. Already my colleague Anthony spoke a bit about that. But I just want to highlight, just to be very clear, it was established in 1964, and I'm looking at that very early period of the FARC. Now, the topic relates, in my case, to the theme of the conference, in that the FARC, at its core, during that really early time, emerged from multiple agrarian movements that were looking to vindicate justice over land ownership, labor conditions, and collective dignity. And so these agrarian movements or rural communities is what is known as campesinado, which is very much a concept of the political subject at the time, and even today we use it. And many of these campesinado were there to give a sense of this indigenous identity to the struggle. So I'm understanding indigeneity not as in the Aboriginal, the original peoples of Colombia, but in a more broad sense, the people that are very much connected with the territory in the way that many of the agrarian movements are linked. And this is precisely what I'm grappling with in my work. And so to get started, I actually want to present just a little snippet of a documentary that I was involved in just last year. And I'm just going to put it up, and I can't find, how do I put up a video? Sorry. Oh, can you see? Sorry, Olivia, if you can help me out with this. I'm trying to put up a video that I have here on my screen, but I don't see anything sharing.
No, I'm not sure actually. If you're sharing your screen, can you? Right,
Yeah,
I'm gonna make
I have it
you
up here. I wonder if maybe, let me just try it. If I can't put it up, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm just going to try to switch in between screens and make sure that it's... Just 1 second, I'll try again. There we go. I think it's up, sorry. Can you guys see the video?
Yes, yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm just going to play very quick. It's just 2 minutes. It illustrates my case. So, yeah.
Ya contale la historia, lo que tu papá pasó. La vida mandaba y la gente se rebeló. Esto aquí era un pueblo muy grande. Esta casa que se ve a la espalda mía era la casa cural de la iglesia. En ese entonces había mucha esclavitud hacia el campesino. Tenían que trabajar a los terratenientes gratis. Entonces pasaron años y años y pues la gente se fue cansando de tanta esclavitud hacia los campesinos, que era muy poquito lo que devengaban y sí mucho lo que trabajaban, pero organizan tomarse en el pueblo. De las provisiones tan grandes, cuando estaban cansados, porque toman el pueblo a ventero derrotado. Entonces a las 5 de la mañana sonó el primer tiro. Claro, cuando comienza el tiroteo, la canción dice que la totazón. Que mi papá, él contaba que un muchacho había hecho una antorcha con una prenda de ropa, le echaba combustible y cogía de casa en casa, le metió en el escandel. Esa guerra duró como casi una semana, casi duró la guerra.
Una actuación que hacía la churravita y es que campesinos, que eso pasaba, pero era como arrasando con todas las viviendas, con todas las vidas. Entonces, donde iban arrasando, cortaban, decapitaban a los campesinos y colocaban sus cabezas en las estacas de los postes.
Eso los acaso casi todos murieron. Eso quedó muchos muertos y casas totalmente quemadas, todas, nada más se veía. Después de un pueblo grande, se veía humo. Este yo tan bonito, todo queda en el recuerdo. Aquella casona vieja que no está con los abuelos, esa casona viejota era la casa rural y la de ritmo rural, por lo menos nacional.
Y ahora hay un proyecto de patrimonialización. Sería muy interesante que justamente la historia de esta casona, tanto el lugar como territorio, pero también la historicidad de lo que fue ese escenario se pudiera dar a conocer.
A un futuro, la queremos es hacer una biblioteca pública aquí. Una biblioteca que vamos a hacer ahí, sí está escrito en las mentes de nosotros, que esto se llega a hacer es una biblioteca. ¡Nos fuimos!
Great. I'll just come back to the presentation very quickly, quicker than this. Great. Okay, so what you guys heard there was carranga. This is a style genre of music in Colombia that's used to tell stories. In this case, we're talking about a very sad event in Colombian history known as the War of Villarrica, the Guerra of Villarrica. This is a very tragic event of state terrorism back in the 1950s that occurred in the largest moor of the world, actually, the Sumapaz. And these are some pictures of the place. It's a very, very beautiful place located in the mountain range of the Andes, where the town of Villarrica resides. So this is basically where it's located, right in the center-south region, very much linked with the origins of the FARC. And now, as I mentioned, this event, this war occurred between 1954 and 1957, bang in the middle of a period in Colombia that is known as the violencia. And so the violencia, or la violencia, is characterized by this belligerent confrontation between the Godo camp, which was the elite in Colombia, and the liberal Cachiporro movement, which was actually where the agrarian movement mostly articulated in political terms. The period was also the witness of the first paramilitary group in the country known as the Chulavita. And we heard a little bit about that in the video. This was an irregular armed faction of these very extremist right-wing regimes. They were basically mercenaries by hired by the elites to do their bidding. Now, in 1954, the ultra-conservative General Dictator Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, who we see in the picture right there, established a junta militar via coup. And it was attempting to dissipate the dispute between these two main political parties. Now, as is often the case, the feuds stemmed from the accumulation of land, wealth, and power. And Suma Paz, as you can imagine, was hugely desirable. These are just a few pictures of the colonization policies back in the 1950s in the period of Rojas Pinilla. And though he sought to end the conflict, actually what happened during the dictatorship is that it gave more power to this side of the socio-political elite, and it just kind of put all the right conditions for the guerrilla insurgencies to emerge. Now, it's worth noting that Rojas Pinilla is regarded in Colombian politics as the regime that introduced McCarthyism, or the anti-communist policies in the countries. So essentially what happened was that Rojas Pinilla, to alleviate the tension, refocused the conflict from Godos versus Cachiporro to all of them against the communists. And this was very much aligned with the policies of US Foreign State Department. Now, following the reports, Rojas Pinilla declared the Communist Party illegal. It prohibited many of the representations, the activities. On top of this came the scaremongering of the left politics, which we know a lot about. And one of the groups that was impacted by was the Campesinado from Suma Paz, because they were supporters of the Communist Party. So that's the context, and we see a lot of that playing out in what we just heard in the video. So basically, by the time of Rojas Pinilla, the Chulavita were hired in Suma Paz to guarantee the monopoly of the land. Now, the conflict there is what we know, and you guys are probably familiarized with this system of hacendado, where one family group acquires land through colonization, fraud, forced migration with no oversight. And it replicates the system of labor exploitation, something that in the video we heard as the slavery, rightly so. And so the Campesinado reacted against that, and that's where the agrarian movement became armed. And so we saw what happened in the video, or what kicked that off. Now, the other thing that's very interesting is looking at the Villarrica movement. This is just a picture of the armed movement. Some of the archives back in the 1950s explain a little bit of what happened in Villarrica. And so the idea was that in Villarrica, they started using the napalm bombs against communities like the ones that you see in the pictures. The napalm bombs, by the way, are the ones with continuous combustion. They were the ones used in the Vietnam War thereafter. In fact, Villarrica is known to be the place where these bombs were first tested outside of the US. And the idea was to swiftly wipe the armed rural community. And so we see that although it was quite effective, it really created just a massive displacement of people. It didn't really eradicate the resistance, but rather the Campesinado was managed to expand the support through this unity around indignation. And so that's when we see a bit more of an organized struggle. And this is, for instance, this is a picture where we see some of the leaders at the front, but much of the Campesinado right at the back, sort of following through. And so the unifying cry at the time was this: La tierra es de quien lo trabaja. Land belongs to those who work it. And this is the moment where this period of the violence or the violencia really takes shape. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm concerned about health in this context. And so why is all of this important? So, okay, firstly, Suma Paz in the conflict of Villarrica is the archetype of Colombian conflict. So the same type of dynamic occurs over and over again in the country's history, but it also presents very strong similarities with other struggles in the Andes. So for instance, in the decade following the Villarrica, during the 1960s, there was an ultra-conservative coalition that came into power after Rojas Pinilla, represented by this man right here, Álvaro Gómez Hurtado. who actually went one step further in eradicating these leftist collectives by officially declaring the Campesinado en Sumapaz independent republic. This is a little bit of the transcription of this official statement. And so this is a video of what he meant with the independent republics. This is the region of Sumapaz, particularly in regions like Planada, Gaitania, El Pato, and Marquetalia. In fact, the bombing of Marquetalia that happened in 1964 is said to be the birth date of the FARC movement. Now, the second reason why this is important is because I begin the analysis with the premise that against the idea of backwardness and underdevelopment about indigeneity, actually communities, local communities anywhere in the world really are never passive actors, but rather communities always find ways to organize their members and face daily challenges by themselves. So rural communities in Sumapaz, despite state violence and the abandonment that they experience, devise different strategies that enable the local economy, healthcare, other forms of well-being. And the FARC, being a belligerent group that on the ground stemmed from the agrarian movement, from these rural communities, in many ways embody the forms of our organization to fuel their struggle. And so that's why there's a little bit of a link there that I see. So interestingly, this starting point of community organization has helped me challenge the traditional understandings of health, because instead of thinking of health as healthcare centers and institutions like hospital clinics or services like surgeries or resources like vaccines or medications, health in the context of this conflict is reframed as a matter of other indigenous and territorial principles and practices. And this is where it gets really interesting for me. So let me explain it this way. In the video, we saw a person, here we see another picture of her, Estrella Guerrero. Estrella Guerrero is one of Sumapaz's most renowned poet and leader of the women's labor movement. And in our conversation about community health during this period of the violencia, her emphasis was not on healthcare institutions or services, but it was more about food security, land, and the products of the lands. So for Estrella, the matter was summarized by the contesting meanings of this concept of land between the different parties involved. So whereas the elites, the so-called the oligarchs and the empire, as she called the elite in Colombia, they equated the land with the profit of agriculture. For the campesinado, she claims that it has more of an existential attachment. She framed this as sentirse alentado, or feeling well, which she describes as this devotion to caring for the land and guaranteeing sustainable production of food, to the extent that if the land does not produce, it is not merely a question of losing income, but it is also the loss of sustenance, the loss of meaning, the loss of safety in their life. So sentirse alentado isn't so much about an absence of disease, but it is the collective capacity to work and the outcomes obtained from it. Now, in my archival work around the campesinado and the period of the violencia, I problematize, or I look at this issue further. So it's very well known that the politics of colonization and the engagement with the land by the rural communities during the Cold War was consistently a question of land ownership, rights to self-determination and community sustenance. So this line, this motto of the tierra para el que lo trabaja, is a cry for a collective autonomy to find a fulfillment in what they do in everyday life. What emerges, and this is sort of the main idea I really present here, that I'm laboring on really, in the FARC Socialist Health, is that connected with this view from Estrella, is that question is really about how does sentirse alentado really play out? So how does the FARC in the context of conflict guarantee the food security? And the answer is this: the communication networks of communications that were established to circulate people, goods, and knowledge. And that is what made everyday life possible during the period of state violence. So you see, during the Villarrica conflict, when the rural population was displaced, the agrarian movement began operations through some tactics that are known now as the war of positions. So this is just an improvised map of many of the things that the people sort of described to me. So Villarrica and Concepcion are these 2 points right here. And what seems really interesting is that when they got this place, they created something that they call the curtain. So basically a strip of land, which is between these 2 points here, where they allocated the militia at the bottom, and then people were pretty much up in the hills, hiding and running away from it. And all the life and all the infrastructure that they put up on the hills, that's what I mean with these networks or communications. So you know, really, this is the main point that I want to describe. So it is said that up in the mountains, according to some of the archives that I read, there could be up to 5,000 people between the fighters, their wives, their children, and the elderly that were displaced. Now, you know, you can imagine sustaining that was quite a big endeavor. Now, during the journeys in the mountains, they had to be constantly moving to prevent or to protect from the air attacks. They also improvised different checkpoints that they called caletas. And this is a picture of caleta. In fact, this is Manuel Marulanda. A caleta was basically a small refuge crafted from the trunk of trees and plantain leaves to rest in the moors while they reach bigger guerrilla camps. Now, the caletas was where life happened, so there was some cooking, and you know, there were different strategies so that they wouldn't get caught. And the journeys were really a way to get, or the caletas were really a way to get into the main guerrilla camps, which in this case.
I'm really sorry. Can you conclude, because we're running over?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I'm trying to keep the time here, but I guess I went over. Yes, sure. I'm just going to say then, I'm just going to skip this very quickly. I'm just going to say that aside from the caletas and the guerrilla camps, there was something else called the economic commissions, which were a small group of people from militia and other women that were in charge of getting food for the people in the camps, and to make sure that the survival of the people moving was guaranteed. Really, what I want to say with all of this is that all of these different elements that I just mentioned are part of what in Sumapaz came to be known as the guerrilla hallway, which was something that didn't just happen in the 50s, but continued on for the rest of the 60 years of the Colombian conflict. And so in my work, I'm focusing on this, on the demystifying the networks, understanding exactly what goods circulated, what was the knowledge that was passed on in between people, and who were the people that were involved in shifting, in transforming, and in making these networks sustainable. And it becomes something quite relevant today, because in the Sumapaz right now, they're trying to create or to expand what is known as the campesino to campesino method, which is something that we can speak about later in the Q&A. But I guess I can conclude there, and I thank you. Sorry about running over the time. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
So I was saying that I would argue instead, based on the 1974 analysis of Quijano of the cultural dominance in the class conflicts, that in the Convención, Blanco was able to build an alternative practical theory by understanding that an effective class alliance in Peru highlands meant a transformation in class position to become an arrendire, a renter peasant, but also to assume the Indio's life, which is a cultural and social experience. So in order to understand how this innovation within the socialist framework in Peru happened, we must understand up to what point Blanco was a man of his time, an expression of the political projects of his generation, and also up to what point he was a creative force that opened what was politically possible for the socialist practice. So the Peru of the 30s, where Hugo Blanco was born, had been the scenario of vigorous anti-oligarchic mass politics, where both mestizo political options in the upper of Aya and the socialism of Mariátegui discussed the place of the Indian question as the path to a modern nation. But for the 50s, the limits started to be very evident. Blanco belonged to a radicalized generation that saw in all parties and in classical indigenism an obstacle for direct action. Thus, the appraised influence of his father, a mestizo or cholo lawyer of a decent family, and the anti-oligarchic liberalism of his teachers in Cusco were not enough. If we consider that since the 30s, the official Peruvian communism had assumed the reformist Pacifico existence of a Soviet line, the Cusco communist was a reformist matter of lawyers and rural teachers who hold all local hierarchies. So the way out for Blanco of this reformism that we find in Cusco and in general in Peru was Trotskyism, first introduced by his brother and then guided in '54 in his studies in Argentina, in La Plata, by Argentinian professor Nahuel Moreno, when he joins Partido Obrero Revolucionario. In these years, the calling to build a permanent revolution by joining unions was a generational project, ignited by the Cuban example that opened the path to the countryside in terms of the working peasant alliance, with the prominence of the former, of course. Therefore, this constant search of a proletariat that Blanco did in unions in Argentina and also back in Lima were the most adequate move in the life of theory. When he was arrested in '58 in Cusco in a city union strike, he spent 2 months in jail where he meets and speaks in a rough Quechua with Andrés González, one of the leaders of the peasant unions that already existed in La Convención Valley. So rejecting the most common way of engaging with the peasants within socialism that was basically just offer legal advice, Blanco decides to join them by becoming an arrendire. Cusco, as the former capital of the Inca Empire and a bursting spot of mercantile capitalism, was a very special place of the encounter between indigenism and union politics. So we can explain this reformulation of Blanco understanding of the Indian question by considering his early readings of indigenista literature like Balcárcer, González Prada, and the promotion of a heterodox adjustment to reality that was followed by his Trotskyist mentor Moreno, that was promoting the decision of Blanco to move to the Roma and Villa Hacienda to become an arrendire. So we can say that even since the 30s, the creative trend of Mariateguism, of this mixing between Andean culture and Marxism, has been politically frozen by a classist reading of the Indian. The seed was potentially there. Moreover, Blanco would later recognize that his friendship with Lorenzo Chamorro, a comunero that had protested against the Hacienda San Jerónimo and was injured by this, would be his indigenous education in his teen years, and are central to consider in deepness all the points of the conflict beyond only the land possession interest. However, these influences and potentialities that were around of the time of Blanco didn't make a premeditated master plan for him. Now I will explain that this new practical theory for action was done, indeed, by Blanco and by the Trotskyists in Cusco, but in a spontaneous way, throughout the encounter with the arrendires. So in order to understand which is the theory of action that he develops in the Convención, we're going to understand this by looking at two aspects: the construction of the dual power he does through unions, and how he understands what it means to be an Indian in the mid-60s in Peru. So I propose that we need to recognize first that this was the plan that he had, was not an illumination of the Trotskyist science, as it is presented in the letters of those years, but it was actually a very messy exploration that can be reconstructed with glimpses of Blanco's honesty in some of the documents that show how he entered La Convención and how he let himself be transformed by the encounter with the arrendires, showing an example of a creative use of Marx's understanding of reality in politics. So the first aspect I was going to talk about, that is the construction of a dual power through unions. For this, we have to understand that Blanco arrived already with a socialist theory of the dual power. This is the need to develop an alternative power to the state to reach a revolutionary stage. It is indicated by Lust that in the letters of '64 that he sends to the Frente de Izquierda Revolucionario, a Trotskyist front Blanco belonged to. Blanco says that the creation of a dual power through the unions was an unconscious and not coordinated process, even though his leadership. At the same time, he also mentions in the letters that they were developing dual power through the party by bringing class consciousness to the peasants. To this apparent contradiction, we can say that there were some planned elements Blanco brought to the Convención, understood as part of the modernization of politics for the peasants. He He was indeed an external element, and he was seen as a student, fluent in Spanish with other lawyers of the federations, as stated by communist Indian Saturnino Wilca. So the entering strategy of Blanco was to present himself as a modernizer, an engineer of the agrarian reform, an advisor that would help them care for the land and for the cattle. In this process, he offered the union the power of the written law, the printer, military discipline, new living conditions, novel elements for political practice and a modern life, to get with their own hands the beds, the shoots, the lands, the books that the hacendado refused them to have. And we can see this very clearly in this extract of the interviews that Hugo Neira, a journalist, made with the peasants of the moment. As Neira says, Hugo Blanco thought the peasants that they could organize beyond the state their own schools and hospitals. To extinguish from the core the bad hygiene habits, it is told that Blanco gave dictatorial orders and a pedalo. For this, the peasants were prohibited from sleeping on the floor and walking without shoes. Now in Chopimayo, there are metal-made beds, and they still use shoes, maybe the ones that Blanco forced them to buy. An inmate in Cusco, a peasant, also says, he's the leader of the peasants. There the combat started in Chopimayo, the Convención, for the abolition of free work. He taught us to build a young militia for defend themselves for the landowners, to use metal beds, to put calamine on the roofs. So even though these modernizing elements explain part of the union capacity to spread, the heart of the union power was in the particular meaning it had on the countryside. That was something that Blanco and the Rendires had to learn together. So they together understood that in contrast to urban strikes where the worker loses the wage, the rural strike meant the freedom to work their lands and not the hacendados. The reformist trajectory of the unions, basically a legal one, was changed by Blanco effective tools and also by the material support that this emergent merchant class, the Rendires could provide. And the land leasures were able to spread all over La Convención and Lares in '61, when they become the legitimate power, taking over land, building alternative institutions, and even intervening in familial and conjugal conflicts. So in this way, both the Rendires and Hugo Blanco were practicing how to establish a union, building dual power that responded to the class conflict with the hacendados, as well as to their aim to self-organize their lives in their own terms. But the successes of the Rendires union, potentialized by Blanco, are not enough to understand the impact of Blanco's presence. As we will see, he was able to develop a different understanding of the class consciousness building to the peasants, that was the vocabulary of the time, towards assuming the Rendire position. So being an Rendire, a rendered peasant, was not only a productive position whose class interests could be mobilized. Blanco understood that the crucial element of what it meant to be an Indio in those times was the humiliation of a way of being human. In the letters of the time, we can see that he's examining the way of life of the Indio, while his sketch has been perfected, offering him a more intimate access to the communities of Arrendires. The decision to work as an Arrendire, adopting new class position, also meant embracing the communal experience of the Indian Arrendires, as well as the landowner and government persecutions that pushed him to an extremely deprived life. And the Arrendires were very aware of how uncommon and important this was. As we can also see here in the parades that Blanco and the Arrendires organized with the traditional clothes, the ponchos, and the chantings in Quechua. And I think it's really important also this picture of Hugo Blanco working with the peasants as he was already an Arrendire there. So with this quote, also by Neira, we can see the impact that, and also the image that Blanco was building for the peasants. Used to having no one making something to transform the condition, they have seen that there is a man that has suffered for them, more than syndicalism incentive that Blanco found robust in the countryside already. It's a phenomenon of loyalty. The peasants do not forget and wait. The persecutions, the anemia, the humiliations suffered by Blanco have turned him, maybe more than his political theories, in a man that the South does not forget. So in the letters and the manuals of the early 60s, we found Blanco using mostly a classical Marxist vocabulary to talk about his political strategy, where he mentions a process of clan consciousness brought to the peasants. But years later, in November of '69, when he has already been incarcerated in Cusco, we see that he founds an alternative framework, a window to express the deepness of his process throughout the correspondence he exchanged with the novelist Arguedas, a national representative of the literature reivindicative of the Quechua world, and also a man that was a mestizo like Blanco, that had adopted the Indio standpoint. In these letters, wrote in the very sweet but vilified Quechua, we found an extremely emotional recognition of how both went through the same process. Blanco states that his heart could break while facing the Argueda novels, that in a similar way to his land seizures and parades, were able to show so much happiness without humiliations by Quechua chants and wearing ponchos, that they were able to say death to the landowners, long live to the man that works, a truth that they never want to hear in Spanish. And Arguedas answers, dear brother, you have like me a quite white face, but with the most intense Indian heart, tears, sing, dance, hate. Imagining their encounter, Hugo says that it could only be done with a placid heart, jalpando the coca leaves, smoking from the same cigar, losing the sight in the remote highlands, possibly remembering how the fusion into Arandillo's Quechua word occurred for him as an embodied experience of sharing a common standpoint. If in the letters of the 60s that we find with Blanco, he had already present some details of the power of the Quechua in the political acts, as well as the importance of a renewed communal criterion to give sense to the peasant unions. Years later in prison, in the reflection he has in prison, and also in this connection with Arguedas, that he found a platform to express the deepness of the changes of the revolution of 1961, hiding his understanding of his own identity. In the book written in jail in '72, Blanco even says, replying to those that accuse him of having a chauvinist, regionalist, even opposed to internationalism posture, and even the unity of Peru. He says that the only way we Indians can become part of humanity is by being Indians. It is a way of being people. So he says that it is not by accident that Velasco government, the revolutionary government of the time, wants to dissolve us into the general category of peasants, as if we don't suffer 1,000 humiliations precisely because we are Indians. So to sum up this part, we can say that the political theory the 60s left, his socialism that Blanco was bringing, was not a tool that by modernizing the Indias would turn them into peasants, but actually his class's position, his class alliance, or the deepness of the class alliance that he proposed, was the path to turning him into an Indio, to share a collective life and the sufferers of the violence from it. So it is crucial to consider that as a Quechua-speaking mestizo, the bridge was potentially there, but it is the Marxist focus of his material class conflicts of La Convención and Lares, and the orthodoxy he practiced, the elements that allowed him to decide such a profound transformation that could not be explained in the classist lens of the time. So just to finish, and not extend myself more, we could say so many things about the national impact of the La Convención revolution. But in order to understand the limitation of this practical theory, this project to assume the Indio position, I would just wrap up by mentioning the tensions that Blanco has to face between the internal dynamic of the peasantry, that with the legalizations of the land seizures, most of them didn't saw the need to continue the mobilization, and the perspective of the totality from the Marxist point of view, of the global revolution of the Trotskyist fronts that needed to expand this alliance with the urban forces. The debates in '63 between Blanco and the FARC followers, Luis de la Puentecilla and Héctor Béjar, that aimed to extend the Convención land seizure without knowledge or previous work in the region, and a Blanco that rejected this sort of application of an external military focuses as the Cuban experience, without a serious consideration of the Peruvian particularities, would be one of the factors that along this military repression and the limited popular impact that the left had in the moment would end this short experience. So just to conclude, we can see in the Blanco experience a socialist that struggles to find a balance between the need to face capitalism from several fronts and also the need and the process of the intimacy of merging into particular experiences. In the next steps of this doctoral project, I will be following the steps in this moment of time of Blanco with field work in La Convención, but also following the next steps that he has with the encounter of the Zapatistas in the 90s as a new reformulation of this practical theory that expands its understandings of alliances and fusion within eco-socialism. Good afternoon. Thanks to the organizer of the conference for giving me the opportunity to present my work. My presentation today is entitled Journeys of Politicization in Latin America and Latin America's Long Cold War. This is part of a larger work about indigenous women making left-wing politics. When in 2019, when I was doing the fieldwork for my PhD, I interviewed Estela Fonseca. This is a pseudonymized name, a Peruvian indigenous woman who in the 1970s took part in the Vanguardism Revolutionary Party and led the Women Affairs Front of her Campesino Union. She told me that as part of her political training during clandestine meetings of her political cell, she read the book Let Me Speak of Domitila Barrios de Chuncara, a Bolivian miner. Estela narrated to me that reading about the life experience of Domitila deeply inspired her political training. Profoundly moved by the book, Estela adopted the name Domitila as her nom de guerre. Then, having in mind Estela's recollection, I returned to read Domitila Barrios' book and found parallels between Domitila and Estela's journeys of politicization to left-wing politics. Moreover, I found that other Peruvian campesino indigenous women like Carmela Giraldo and Maria Loaiza, from whom I learned during my fieldwork in 2019, underwent similar paths to politicization. Likewise, I identify connections with experience recounted by Comandante Ramona of the Zapatista Army of the National Liberation, Zapatista Army of National Liberation in Mexico. My presentation today is divided in 3 sections. First, I will briefly introduce the woman I mentioned before. Then I will explain the journeys of politicization, and finally, I will present 3 conclusions. Indigenous women in left-wing politics. Carmela Giraldo is a very well-known peasant leader in the Convention peasant movement, which Tania was talking before. Carmela played a crucial role in the Convention movement carried out during the 1950s and 1970s, demanding agrarian reform, freedom, justice, and education, and protesting the abusive Hacienda system. Carmela was literate and fluent in Spanish and English. In her early 20s, she arrived at La Convención with her parents and siblings and began working as an arrendire, a person who rents land to landlords. By the 1950s, she was a young widow with a child. During this decade, she became a unionist and a communist and a crucial leader of the Convención Campesino movement, but her struggles and story are unknown. Maria Loaiza, another indigenous woman from Cusco, from the 1950s until the 1970s, created and led unions through which street and market vendors advocate not only for better trade and life conditions, but also join and support labor unions in their quest for radical transformation. Maria became a leader of the United Markets of Cusco, and together with other unionists, male and female, as well as leftists from different backgrounds, she led huge mobilizations in Cusco during the 1950s and 1960s. Domitila Barrios was a Bolivian miner and a unionist of international renown. Born in the mining town of siglo XX, she became a prominent figure in the labor movement in Bolivia. Thanks to her testimony given to the feminist sociologist Moema Dizer, we all learned about her participation in the Comité de Amas de Casa of her mine union and her denunciation of the dreadful living situation and living conditions of mine workers and their families. Domitila's involvement in the National Federation of Bolivia Mine Workers propelled her into a leadership role where she advocated for rights of miners and by extension, the broader working class. Comandante Ramona, born as Maria La Soledad Ramirez, was a remarkable indigenous leader and a central figure of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation in Mexico. Born into the Tzotzil Maya community in the highlands of Chiapas, she experienced injustice faced by indigenous peoples in Mexico. Ramona joined the Zapatista Army when she was 14 years old. As she said in the beginning, in this army, there were only 2 of us women among the 8 of 10 people who began the movement. Most of the women I am analyzing here joined their respective revolutionary projects in their youth, but Ramona was the youngest of all of them to join a revolutionary movement. Her involvement in the 1994 Zapatista Uprising brought international attention to the struggles of indigenous communities in Mexico. Comandante Ramona not only fought for land rights and autonomy, but also became a prominent advocate for the role of women in revolutionary struggle. She emphasized gender equality within Zapatista ranks and encouraged women to actively participate in both military and political aspects of the movement. Stella Fonseca, the woman I told you about at the beginning, was a vanguardia revolutionary militante. Vanguardia revolutionary was a Peruvian party that advocated for revolutionary transformation and head of Women's Affairs Front of ANTA and the Cusco Campesino Union. She, together with other women from her rural community, created and joined the Pucasonjo Huarmicuna cell, which is Quechua, in Spanish means Mujeres de Corazón Rojo, or in English means red-haired woman. From my perspective, the existence of this cell illustrates a campesino woman, along with the students, intellectuals, and workers, were an important part of national and international left-wing movement aspiring to create a new state, nation, and society. Despite being born in different settings and temporalities, indigenous women joined revolutionary parties and organizations for similar reasons: to end subordination of indigenous and working class people through revolutionary change. They also share different agendas concerning class, ethnicity, and gender. Importantly, their limited access to formal education did not hamper their political training and politicization. Even talking now about journeys of politicization, when I was reading the life experience of these different women, I identified that they all followed this kind of journey that I am going to talk about now. Even though Domitila, Estela, Maria, Carmela, and Ramona grew up in different settings and temporalities and belonged to different generations, the gender, indigeneity, social class, and rurality made them share a history of subordination and oppression, as well as a history of resistance, struggle, and agency. Despite the difference that exists among them, they all learn and join about politics in the following settings: families and communities, where their political awareness born; unions, where they further their political commitment; social mobilizations, or as they call streets, where they acquire political recognition; and political projects. This could be a revolutionary party, a revolutionary movement, where they advocate for revolutionary transformation. Talking about the first topic, among these women, there is a sense or an elaborated memory, and therefore a narrative, that their political awareness derives from the histories of rebellion of their ancestors, narrated to them by their relatives and other members of their communities. Throughout oral histories passed through myths, tales, and collective memories. The women I interviewed in Cusco, for example, learned about the rebellion of Tupac Amaru, of the rebellion their local leaders led against oppressive hacendados in the early 20th century. Likewise, Comandante Ramona in an interview with the Doble Jornada newspaper, said, "My family was already in the struggle before I was born." Domitila Barrios also narrated that when she was a child, she saw her father's participation and leadership in minor unions and stressed the enormous influence that the 1952 Bolivian Revolution and the Revolutionary National Movement had on the generation of her father as well as her generation. Among them, among the women I am analyzing, there is a memory of the persistent repression their relatives and communities experienced in the past when demanding access to land, in the case of Stella, or Stella demanding land in the case of Stella, for example, or demanding better working conditions in the case of Domitila. Then another setting where they furthered their political commitment were the unions. Unions were the natural and by default political schools for these women because most of them couldn't access to formal education. Indigenous women joined unions because they saw unions as a setting to channel their demands and hopes for change. In Cusco, for example, campesino unions practiced a peculiar form of syndicalism because it was composed of atypical union actors, campesinos. The aims of these unions were not restricted to demanding labor rights. Their members also demanded social justice, freedom from oppressive hacendados, access to land, and establishment of schools. Cusco peasants were not just allies of unionists and students. Campesinos endorsed and expressed syndicalism and Marxism from the early 20th century as much as they did again in the mid-century when where they founded peasant or campesino unions to fight against hacendados. Likewise, influenced by the Cuban Revolution, they advocate for revolutionary change. In Cusco, as elsewhere in Latin America, grassroots organization publicly upheld the revolution of the Barbudos, read Cuban newspapers, listened to radio broadcasts, and sang revolutionary songs. Within these unions, they learned a Marxist reading of their social situations. As Domitila Barrios put it, she had some preparation as a result of the experience of the people. She said, my own experience and the few books I have been able to read, as well as the learnings and struggles with her union. She said, I owe my awareness and preparation to the shouts, sufferings, and experience of the people within her union. Then another setting that I have identified where these women went through to advance and enhance their political participation and political awareness and develop their dreams and aspirations of revolution or social movements, or streets as they call it, to it, where they acquire political recognition as well. In different contexts and settings in which Domitila, Estela, Maria, Carmela, and Ramona acquired, developed, and furthered their political aims, they all voice radical and critical perspective about the state and capitalism. Domitila and Ramona, in addition, stress the oppression and violence that the indigenous women face in their close communities. Also, they all participate and create a specific organization for women within their respective unions or revolutionary parties or projects, aiming to promote women's participation and women's empowerment, as well as women's collaboration to radical transformation. Domitila participated and led the Comité de Amas de Casa. Estela was the head of the Women's Front of her union, and later in the mid-1980s helped to create a Campesino Women Federation. Maria and Carmela led not only their unions, but also the Women's Secretariat of their unions. Ramona went further by drafting the revolutionary law on women. However, neither of them joined feminist organizations of support feminism. The other setting which I identify where these women further and share their revolutionary commitment were of course political parties or revolutionary projects where they advocate for revolutionary change precisely.
All the women I analyze here join politics aiming to bring about a radical transformation for the historical oppression, exclusion, and subordination of indigenous people in their respective countries. A revolutionary transformation has different meanings for the woman I am analyzing here, but first and foremost, it meant having power. Power to change their historical exclusion and power to decide about their future and access to justice. Domitila and Stella said, "We know that our liberation will come one day and that the people will be in power." By the people, in this case, means el pueblo, right? El pueblo indígena campesino. Since their aspiration coincide with what revolutionary projects and leaders were advocating, they joined revolutionary parties and movements as well as aspired to socialism. For instance, Domitila Barrios argued in relation to having power. Of course, this will not be given to us as a gift. It will cost a lot of blood and a lot of struggles, as it happens with other countries. That is also so important that we have contact with the people who already live in socialism. In Bolivia, we try to do this as socialist ideas penetrate the working class in such a way that in the last Congress of the Bolivian Workers' Union in 1970, the resolution was that Bolivia will only be free when it is a socialist country. Within these revolutionary political projects, as political activists and leaders, they taught other men and women from rural towns, labor unions, and women's organizations how to create and run social organizations, and also serve as intermediaries between people and university students, political leaders, and state functionaries. For instance, Stella replicated the political training she received in her political cell in the cell she helped to create in her community in the Anta province. They also voiced their critical perspectives about their unions, parties, and movements, and their leaders, and how their leaders were leading and shaping their revolutionary projects. Carmela, Maria, and Stella in Cusco questioned how their leader ran communities, Communist Front and the Vanguardia Revolutionary Party. In Bolivia, Domitila said, "That's why I think that we, the Bolivians, must pay attention to the experience of those peoples, to their mistakes and their achievements. By uniting to seek a solution according to what Bolivia is, our people, or situation, and not spend our time fighting among ourselves to see what Russia, China, or Cuba says, and distracting ourselves only in defending on more than other. Marxism, as I understand it, should be applied to the reality of each country." To conclude, I have three conclusions. To what extent these journeys of politicization in left-wing politics and revolutionary movements, as described here, were similar to those of other indigenous women in Latin America is yet to be analyzed. Likewise, a comparison is needed to examine how different these journeys are to those of women from urban and middle backgrounds who also join revolutionary movements. Still, the task is to continue exploring the life stories of Latin American women from indigenous backgrounds to help comprehend the journeys and factors that enable and further their politicization and political participation in left-wing projects. One of my conclusions is that at this point in my research, I argue that there exists a shared journey to politics among women from indigenous backgrounds. Similarly, their narratives also reveal common paths to resistance, empowerment, and struggle, showing that both their subordination and strategies to overcome those situations transcended geographical and cultural boundaries. Second, by analyzing the networks of politicization, roles and political strategy, demands and agendas, narratives and discourses, and diverse political trajectories, I also argue that Latin American indigenous women contribute to making the Latin American left in a context shaped by the Cold War rationale. In this context, Latin Americans and indigenous women in particular were more often participants and protagonists than passing victims. They belong to a political generation that proposed a radical transformation of the left and a left-wing agenda with new methods and strategies to mobilize people for revolution. They were not only active members of unions engaging in contesting politics, but also active members of political cells, parties, and movements, where they advance and disseminate their political ideologies. Their stories, along with those of male and female leftists from various social and cultural backgrounds, show the multi-class nature of the left wing of the Latin American left. Finally, unveiling women's history in Latin America's long Cold War implies theoretical and methodological challenges due to the gendered and clandestine nature of left-wing movements during the 20th century. It is also challenging because women's history in general and the history of indigenous campesina women in particular are not recorded in the traditional historical narrative and sources. To find these women's roles and participation, we do not only need historical and anthropological, but also archaeological skills. However, digging new sources to identify and unveil indigenous women's political links to socialism during the 20th century also implies time and funding, which, as you all know, are limited sources. Thus, it is imperative to create new rigorous approaches to telling their stories, because otherwise, academics will keep saying that due to the lack of sources, it is not possible to write, in quotation marks, proper women's history. The problem with this situation is that indigenous women's participation in radical politics will continue to be unknown. I began this presentation by talking about Estela Fonseca's admiration for Domitila Barrios de Chuncara. And in 1985, when Estela, another campesina woman, created the first Woman Campesina Federation, they invited Domitila to attend the opening meeting, where Domitila was the keynote speaker. This connection between Estela and Domitila also illustrates the intergenerational solidarity and shared commitment with grassroots movements, another topic we need to continue exploring. Thank you.